Good afternoon. My name is Cliff Marchek. I'm the Coordinator of Community Service at the William S. Boyd School of Law. Welcome to the video on service of process. Now, once a complaint for paternity has been filed or a complaint for divorce, the plaintiff must ensure that the complaint and summons are served. And the process is the same regardless if it's a complaint for paternity, custody, and visitation, or a complaint for divorce. The rules are very specific. The rules are governed by our United States Constitution, which requires that all persons are entitled to due process of law. Once the complaint is filed, the plaintiff must ensure that the complaint and summons are served onto the defendant. Service generally must be called personal service, meaning that the summons and complaint must be handed directly to the defendant. The plaintiff himself cannot serve the complaint. The plaintiff must hire a third person or have a third person above the age of 18 who's not a party to the action or the lawsuit serve the complaint. The professionals that serve the summons and complaint are the constable's office, the sheriff's office, or any civil licensed process server. Once the complaint and summons have been filed, then the plaintiff must take these documents, the summons and the complaint, to one of these service agencies or anyone over the age of 18. You must provide a description of the defendant and a location at which he or she may be served. Once the summons and complaint are filed with a court, the plaintiff must see that the defendant is personally served. And in order to do that, the plaintiff should hire a professional and provide a description of the defendant to that professional. Again, agencies that serve papers are the constable's office, sheriff's office, or any licensed process server. So the plaintiff will take these papers, the summons and complaint, to, for example, the constable's office, pay the service fee that the constable requires. Usually it's going to be between $30 and $50. And then the constable will take the summons and complaint and go to that location and hand the papers, that is the summons and complaint, to the defendant. Now, the process server can serve the defendant anywhere that the process server is lawfully entitled to be. So you can serve the defendant at his home, you could serve him at his work, you could serve him at any public place, you could serve him at a friend's house, if that's where you know where he is. One exception to serving it directly onto the defendant is if you serve the defendant at his home, it can be served on any adult, and that constitutes proper service. So for example, let's say the defendant is living with his adult sister and the constable goes to the adult sister's home and the defendant's not there, the constable could leave it with the adult sister, and that would be valid service onto the defendant. The other form of service is by publication. That is, if the plaintiff cannot locate the defendant, or if the defendant is making him or herself unavailable for service, then the plaintiff can pursue or serve by publication through a newspaper. However, before the plaintiff can do that, she must first make a reasonable effort to locate the defendant, and that has to be done through what's called an affidavit of due diligence. This form is available at the Self-Help Center. Also, a third person must perform this due diligence. Due diligence is just a fancy phrase that means make a reasonable effort to locate the defendant. Generally, the plaintiff will have to have a professional perform this due diligence affidavit for a couple of reasons. One, professionals know where to look for people. They have access to certain records that individuals don't. Private investigators are the best source to perform due diligence affidavits. The private investigator will make a reasonable effort to locate the defendant. It may include calling him at his last known place of residence, last place of work, calling friends or family. A private investigator may have access to certain public records, such as DMV records or utility records. If the location of the defendant is discovered during this process, then the investigator can personally serve the defendant, and that's valid personal service as previously discussed. However, if the process server cannot locate the defendant, then that process server will prepare an affidavit of due diligence documenting all those efforts made to serve the defendant. That affidavit of due diligence, along with an affidavit of service by publication and an order for service by publication, will be submitted by the plaintiff to the judge the plaintiff's case was assigned to. If the judge determines that the plaintiff made a reasonable effort to locate the defendant, the judge will sign an order allowing the plaintiff to serve by publication. Once the plaintiff has received that order, then he or she must go to a paper of general circulation and pay a fee to have a small version of the summons published in a paper, and it will be published once a week for 4 weeks. Now, most people are not going to see that. So, what happens is after the 4 weeks expires, the plaintiff must wait 20 days for the defendant to answer. If the defendant does not answer the complaint within 20 days after the last publication, the plaintiff can then enter the default of the defendant and request a prove-up hearing, which will be described later, to get your order, whether it be to establish paternity, possibly custody and child support, or to get divorced and receive whatever the plaintiff requested in the complaint for divorce.